Yeah, okay. Eventually I'll abandon this thing and just yell. So, good morning. As Ellen explained to you, we're going to do 3 panels this morning, and this is the first panel, which is going to focus on science and potential reorganization of science, or at least our recommendations for reorganization of science to address multiple stressors. The underlying concept of what we've proposed is pretty simple, and what we're saying is that the current scientific institutions are not able to handle the cross-cutting aspects of multiple stressors. So we have made some suggestions, a radical notion, a JPA, which we suggested in the report be modeled after SQUIRP, for example, and San Francisco Estuary Institute, and the kind of work they are doing. So we used that as a guide. And have a series of recommendations there, which we'll cover here. I do want to tell you what our motivation is behind that. And the argument is we litigate over science. That's where it starts. That's what the lawyers get involved. That's how Judge Wanger became the lead scientist for the Delta for so many years. We were litigating over science, and is there a way, and this is the proposal, is there a way to reduce litigation over science and transfer it to litigation over policy? Because that's what we're really litigating about. In most cases, it's not the science, but that's where we start. So that was our proposal. So our panel today, we have Jeff Keitlinger, who's in the trenches on this issue all the time, and is the head of the Metropolitan Water District. We have Terry Young, who wears many hats, and she says she's not wearing a hat today. And that is, Terry has got experience both as a regulator and a scientist and an advocate, which gives us a very broad perspective here. We have Peter Goodwin, who is the lead scientist for the Delta Science Program, and we have Bruce Herbold, recently retired from EPA and representing pretty much whatever Bruce feels. So the way we want to do this is I'm going to lead with a series of questions for each one of the panelists, and then we'll work forward from there, and then hopefully we'll have enough time for a Q&A at the end of this. And this is an unusual format. I'm really glad my wife said not to wear the kilt today. Here we are. All this. So okay. We're going to see how much trouble we're having with these mics. Jeff, we're going to go ahead and start with you. And you and I have had personal conversations about this issue a great deal in the past, sort of how to manage science. And we're going to focus on the disparity, the aspects that we saw within our report, both our surveys, the strong differences between the results of the agency scientists and the overall scientific community and the divergence with the stakeholder groups. So I'd like you to sort of address that, your views of sort of how that's evolved and what the causes are behind it. And then also, as I say, if we have a little bit of time, we're going to try and limit our conversation to fairly short bits. Maybe weigh in a little bit on how that's affecting policy. So Jeff, you start.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Seems to be working. Mine is. So. I appreciate this. I figured it was sort of an odd choice to be on this panel in the sense that I'm not a scientist at all. Realistically, I guess what I am is a kind of a quasi-decision maker, but really a synthesizer. My job is to synthesize a lot of information from scientists, engineers, lawyers, economists, everybody on my staff, boil it down and make recommendations to my board of directors, who then has to make very expensive decisions. And I try to probe and push and get all that best information, synthesize it best I can. And so I was looking at that chart, and I noticed you had a bunch of people, you had fish, Delta, government, and it kind of went spelled fudge, all those, with an X, fudge X. And there's a lot to that. And and then I was listening to Ellen. I didn't realize we were going to be talking about combat science per se, but I don't know that that's necessarily such a bad thing sometimes, combat science, because what that fudge chart shows is something I always figure, where you stand on an issue depends a lot on where you sit. And I used to be my agency's chief counsel, and I had very strong views of what to do. Now I'm the general manager, and I listen politely to my lawyers, and then I say, yeah, but we're not going to do that. And I appreciate their input, but what I do now is very different than when I was advising on just a pure legal aspect. And so when I listen to the regulators and they say this is what the science does, they have a mission. And that's a very legitimate mission. But they approach that, they approach their science, they approach everything from a perspective, a very legitimate perspective, but it is a perspective. The legislature gave my agency a mission. And so I look at the same facts, and I come to sometimes different conclusions. And that is what happens when you approach things from different perspectives. So much of the science that, one of the useful things I think about being a lawyer sometimes is that you're kind of trained to be a skeptic, you're trained to probe. And so many times, I'll be pushed on, here's why we should do this. And so much of what we do on these things are built around correlations. And often, I remember as a kid, I always read James Bond books. So I remember James Bond once say about correlations or things. He said, 1 time's happenstance, 2 is coincidence, 3 times enemy action. So fair enough. That's kind of how I look at a lot of these correlations. And I also can like to have fun with my staff and say, well, all right, if it's all about wet years, show me what happened in these dry years. Show me what happened in these other years. Because I can also just say, I've seen 70% of the time when the National League wins the All-Star game, we end up with a Republican president. So tell me how that factors into it. You can do a lot with this information, but you have to be a little skeptical. You have to push back. And I believe sometimes the combat science, getting a new perspective, changing that dynamic, getting new ways to look at things can be valuable. It's kind of Darwinism in a way. Let's get all the theories out there and push them and fund them and see what information we have. As a practical matter, I do think we're getting more collaborative, and I think that's useful. But I think it's more than collaboration and consensus. It's more about transparency, making sure all the data's out there, pushing for the best science, but also just pushing for different theories. If we had all the answers, it would be a lot easier. If it were easy, we'd have done all these things a long time ago. So we're going to have a lot of competition. We're going to have different theories. But I do think, some things I think are really important is, what I'm hearing now from people is not if we should do something, but what should we do. That's a change. 5 years ago, there was a lot of debate whether or not we needed to change things. I think everyone agrees we need to change things, and we need to do it fairly quickly. A lot of debate still exactly what we should do, but I think we're more working towards the same goals and moving in the same direction. Probably not as fast as we need to, but I do think we are making great strides on pushing collaboratively to get, hopefully, to a better place.
Thanks, Jeff. Any comments from other panel members? I got one quick question for you, Jeff. It's a quick follow-up. Why? Why is there such a striking disparity, though, between the views of the exporters and the views of the agency scientists, the university scientists, and even the policymakers within it? What lies at the root? It's such a difference.
Well, I think one of the mistakes people make is that we somehow, I hear a lot of this, sound science will lead to good decisions. And what's unsound science? What are these ideas? Of course we all want sound science. Of course we all want to do these decisions. They're just really tough decisions. They are policy decisions. They are very unpopular decisions. We're basically saying, we're making choices. Someone's going to get less. Someone's going to get more. We're going to make tough choices, and these lead to very different perspectives. And it's not like the science will say, yes, gore that ox and protect this one. Those are political, tough choices. We're not very good as a society at making tough choices. We all want consensus, win-wins. They're not all win-wins. And so that's going to lead to pretty tough, differing perspectives, and then you can play with the science to try and back your perspective.
Thanks. It's Jay Lund who said, sound science is science that sounds good. Bruce, let me turn to you, sort of follow on this, and having been in EPA for so many years on the regulatory, the science for regulation side, one of the strong criticisms that you have probably heard repeatedly is that the big agency complex, the science complex of the agency has failed over these years to actually reduce our uncertainties, and it actually increased our uncertainties rather than reducing, although Jeff gives a much more optimistic simplistic view of that at this point. I'd like you to sort of respond to this notion that we identified, the inability of the agency complex to deal with cross-cutting issues and multiple stressors.
The way you put that just makes me put away the notes.
That was the
idea.
There
was a lovely presentation at the science conference last year, starting off in the plenary session with knowledge and ignorance, and knowledge being a small island in a sea of ignorance. And as that island gets bigger and you learn more, the area around that in the sea of ignorance gets longer and longer, so that you realize how much you don't know as you learn more. So that's kind of inevitable. It also keeps scientists funded, which is another good thing. But I really latched onto that picture of that expanding hole and the increasing circumference means, oh hell, we realize now that we don't know that. So that's interesting. I also just want to respond to Jeff's comment about combat science. On a personal note, my first scientific publication was a refutation of a paper that my major professor and another graduate student had just written. That kind of set the tone for my career, I think. But that kind of combat is the meat of the scientific life. I think you're wrong, and I'm going to show you why. And I define combat science differently. I find it when the science can be traced back to a particular ox. And I'm going to protect my ox no matter what. That tobacco doesn't cause cancer because, damn, my family has been growing tobacco for 100 years and it can't possibly cause cancer. That's what I think of as combat science. When your conclusions are not influenced because you think somebody is wrong, but because you want to prove that they're wrong because it's in your favor. That's where I start going, ew. But the joyous, I'm going to show you you're wrong. That's I think the blood of everybody that actually does science. So you were asking me about how science has changed in the last 30 years. I'm going to go back onto the question that you promised to ask me.
In fairness, I had said to Bruce, I'm also going to ask you how science multiple stresses has changed for the last 30 years. He's right. I was going to ask that.
This happened in my orals exam also. I was told what questions I was going to get asked, and I was asked different ones. But it seems to be you university professors,
Our goal in oral exams is to make you look stupid.
You succeeded on that occasion, too. But I just wanted to go at how science has changed in this estuary over my career. And when I started with Peter Moyle at UC Davis, I was one of maybe half a dozen people in the state that could have told you what a delta smelt looked like. Probably only one of half a dozen in the state that ever held one in his hand. It was an obscure bit of biology. Everything was focused on striped bass and salmon in terms of fish. And then the Endangered Species Act came in and things changed. And some of the salmon became endangered. And so that brought a lot of attention. But when I started, I was attracted to a cooperative group, the Interagency Ecological Program, because it was a bunch of diverse people who liked to get together and argue, especially in a little group called the Food Chain Group, which was not limiting themselves to just salmon and striped bass, but to kind of the ecosystem of the Delta. It was a group of 8 people. And you were really only allowed in the room if you were doing science. And we were vicious to each other. It was lovely. It was a good time. Then everything got excited. The state board had new hearings coming up, and I got hired by EPA. And as part of that, I went and listened to some of these. And that was where real combat science was suddenly, I was exposed to it. Oh my God. People with perfectly good fish backgrounds were getting up in front of policymakers and saying that dams were good for salmon, in some way implying that salmon could swim through them, or that they survived the passage, that the young ones survived the passage through the turbines downstream. And I was going, how can they do this? And as Ellen described, that continues to be the case. If you are being paid by people X, they will find somebody who will say what they want to hear. And that kind of combat science is what I fear we're getting back into now. We got away from it because after we went through a period with the state board of not making a decision, and then EPA and the state board did come out with rules, and that led to CalFed, and there was a major change. Science went from being the purview of few people that were interested in it into being a very large, transparent CalFed has a lot of I think, praise to be given to it for making people expect to know what science was going on and why, and what people were doing. Having conferences where people's presentations were made in front of groups of hundreds of people. So that became an expectation that science was going to be a very public process. And that's a sad thing, partly because nobody becomes a scientist because they want to get up in front of a room full of 300 people and talk about it. That's just not the way it is, but that's what is now expected. And so we get some disconnects of people being able to get science out there. But it did change. We went from kind of isolated things. I have a favorite story in the early days of IEP. The DWR biologists would drive down to Stockton to take water quality samples, while the fish and game people in Stockton would drive up to Sacramento to take water quality samples, sometimes on the same day. So there's a lot of cooperation that has developed, and that has since become not just simply mechanics, but also IEP has finally gone away from just being funded to look at the impacts of the water projects into looking at ecological stuff. And that's been really fun. The last 7 years or so, we got charged very clearly with go and find out why all the fish died. And IEP scientists actually managed to get a lot of university people in, a lot of consultants in, and start doing some synthetic work. That has been really some of the most exciting work that I've been involved with, because it stopped looking at one factor and started looking at all of them, and by then, like Murder on the Orient Express, everybody's guilty. Some people are more guilty than others, and it's always nice to say that it's your fault, or yours, or it's anybody's but mine, as Ellen was describing. But anybody that says, no, it's all somebody else's is probably trying to gore somebody else's ox to protect their own. And I just wanted to say that now, I think we have an opportunity again. We're trying to revitalize that CalFed approach of bringing people together on a common problem. And it's that common problem definition. If you can get that, if you can say, we're going to build an atomic bomb, we're going to find the Higgs boson. If you can you're going to find out why the fish all died. Clear question. That appeals to scientific work and brings diverse people together. If it's, we're going to find science that is going to make all the stakeholders happy, that's probably not going to work. And I think that's part of why CalFed failed, was they were trying to figure out how to make everybody happy. And if it's a scientific question, you take the answers, and then policymakers may decide we can't afford to do what that science implies. We're going to have to try something else. That's fine. But what I keep seeing is, no, we're going to prove that science is wrong, or we're going to go find somebody who will say what we want it to say. And that smears science broadly. And that's unfortunate, because I think that's a useful tool. Policymakers should be using that as a tool. It's not going to give an answer. It's going to give you, this is going to work, this is going to work less well. What can you afford to do? That's policy questions. Trying to make it combat science, not a long-term sustainable approach.
Okay, that's good. Anybody want to make a comment on that from Bruce? One of the criticisms of science, even in IEP, is, and you actually highlighted it, is that it is crime scene investigation, and that is what killed all the fish. That's not going to work for BDCP. It's what's it going to be tomorrow, and what are the solutions. So that it was and being a member of that scientific community that was really interested in what killed the fish, and it was what we were born and bred to do as scientists. What we were not born and bred to do was to come up with solutions that look forward quite a long period of time, which is what BDCP is attempting to do right now.
Yeah, and that's where, when I read how things will be in 50 years, I want to roll on the floor kicking my feet in the air.
Again?
It just makes me
Still?
hysterical.
Yeah.
Because I imagine what it would have been like in 1963 to have said, well, in 2013, this is the way we're going to operate. But the only way forward through that is not to pretend that you know something, but to set up a process that can deal with, the things you know are going to happen, the things that you think might happen, and then all of those things that you have no idea are going to happen, And that requires a sound scientific structure that can respond to the crime scenes as they come along and not try to say, oh, we're going to figure out who killed him 50 years down the road. That just makes me
So you're the
hysterical.
Donald Rumsfeld of the Delta now. Known knowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns.
I don't know if I've ever been called worse than that.
That's right. But you yourself said you were hysterical.
I don't know whether, I
It is
guess this is on. Just a brief comment on what Bruce said. I guess I'm a glass half full person because I feel that the science that we have now is really pretty solid and expansive compared to the science that we had when all of us started our careers, which was, in science and geologic time not that long ago. It seems, we've aged, but science progresses slowly and steadily, and I think we've made tremendous progress. It's just that the problems have outpaced our ability to find the answers. So I was going to put in a plug for science not necessarily always being the weak link.
I do want to just point out there's a lovely series of graphs that the lead scientist for IEP, Anke Mueller-Zolger, cranks out each year of the number of publications based on IEP's funding or data. And it's this just logarithmic growth increase. It's an amazing change just in the last 10 years. The topics covered, the people involved, has blossomed. It's very, very fun.
And this success reminds us that people matter in this. You can make the best structure you want, and it doesn't work. And it goes back to Randy Brown, I think, and that overall change in culture in IEP, which went to the peer review, promoting peer review publication, getting results out, being more transparent, and I'm just sorry he's not here to enjoy it. So we're going to change subject a little bit here, and in that all reports like that we write at PPIC are often short on specifics, and they include a fair criticism of, and then a miracle will occur. And so we have a fair amount of, and then a miracle will occur in this particular report. One being that this concept of a JPA, creating a community of science associated with the JPA, will actually create, let's imagine that the state and federal water contractors are working hand in hand, I know this is hard for some of you to imagine, with the fish agencies on developing a common plan for science, common approaches for science, and will have ownership, have mutual ownership of the science, which is the concept within the JPA. And again, we're not being original in this, we've seen this work elsewhere and how it's worked elsewhere. So let me put this to you, because you've been in all of these roles. You know so many roles. And then a miracle occurs is based on that. Is there any proof or notion that, in fact, this would really improve things to have this kind of common approach, common pool to science? So I'm giving you the opportunity to really criticize what we wrote.
My answer is, well, yes and no. I do think if you rephrase the question in terms of basically two things. There are two things that you're after. One is, if we have better science, will that engender better decision making? The second is, if we have better science, will that decrease the amount of combat science and the amount of conflict? And that's the part I'm a little bit skeptical about. But looking at your report, I deconstructed it in my own mind to have basically three problems that you described about our current science in the Delta. And the first problem is fragmentation. That's an issue that the National Research Council focused on quite extensively as well. And by that, I think you are meaning fragmentation of science in terms of geographical areas, fragmentation of science in terms of the stressors, fragmentation of the science in terms of which institution is looking at, which institution's science program is looking at which particular thing, because people have certain legal responsibilities. And it's the fact that we have all of those pieces, but not the whole, that is one of the problems, and PPIC avers that in its report. It was also in the National Research Council report, and I think that is a problem. I think it's a solvable problem, and I would say that your proposal for the JPA is a reasonable way to address that problem. The idea is to have one central locus where people get together and look specifically at the problems that span all of these little pieces, all of these fragments, and then try to come up with a very solid and realistic and targeted plan to answer the questions that need to be answered. So I think your solution fits the problem. I think it has a chance of working. I have been in the position of being able to build on one of the success stories, because when I have my hat on as a member of the regional board in the San Francisco Bay Area, we do get information that comes in from the San Francisco Estuary Institute. It's reliable. Everyone agrees that this is the starting point, and then people argue about other things. There's always other things to argue about, right? But we have the foundation of the science, and we're not arguing about the science. And they've done a very good job of strategically figuring out what it is that, what are the questions that we need to have answered. And if we could duplicate that in the Delta, I would say that would solve one of the problems. That would solve the fragmentation problem. Now, the second really problem that PPIC talks about quite a bit is the problem of combat science. And it is unfortunate when you have non-scientists actually, like Judge Wanger, having to make these decisions. And so it would be a nice idea to be able to avoid this problem, but I'm not sure that it really is a solvable problem with the proposed structure or with any other structure, because, as we've seen, not everybody relies on reliable science if they don't like it. And as long as there are other avenues, as long as there are political avenues or legal handles that people can use to end run what everybody else thinks is reliable science, they're going to do it. I mean, it's human nature. It's, we all could probably trade name tags with other people that we know, and we would be looking at the facts quite a bit differently. I don't think that's going to change. I think it's I'm going to throw it to the next panel. You guys have to clean up your institutions so that there isn't the opportunity that there is now to do the end run of science. Now, PPIC has, as part of their proposal for the JPA, said that one of the tricks is going to be having this centralized location for science include in its management or governance structure the regulated entities and the regulators. I would very forcefully argue that one should also include the nonprofit, environmental or fish and wildlife representatives and the academia. Otherwise, it has the capacity to sort of be a backroom deal on science between the regulators and the regulated entities, and that's not what we're searching for. Again, San Francisco Estuary Institute, I think, is a very good model for success. Sitting at the regional board, it's been so nice to have a little bit of agreement among people when they come in the door. But realistically speaking, it might work, it might not. Kind of depends on who's involved and the culture of those people, as you've mentioned. The third and final problem that I sort of deconstructed out of the PPIC report is the problem of uncertainty. And is this a solvable problem? Around the edges, maybe, but I think Bruce did a nice job of describing the fact that uncertainty is always going to be bigger than we are and bigger than our capacity to deal with it. The Delta is an extremely complicated system. It just guarantees practically that all of the big, hard decisions that we have are going to be based on science that has a great deal of uncertainty surrounding it. I have my colleague Gordon Orions is fond of saying, ecology isn't rocket science. It's way more complicated. You can just count on it. And I think we can count on every tough, expensive decision that's coming at us with respect to the delta and the upstream and downstream systems is going to have a lot of uncertainty. We're going to be weighing uncertain effects and benefits for the ecosystem against very certain costs for the various different economic actors in the state. And we just better be prepared for that. And I'm, again, throwing it to the next set of panels because I think our institutions have to develop the decision-making criteria that are going to be used for the delta, knowing that there is this uncertainty and there's an imbalance between the certainty that science can provide and the certainty that economics can provide. So with that, I repeat, my answer is yes and no. I think PPIC has come up with something that could really help. Will it solve all the problems? No, but knowing which problems we might and might not solve going into it, I think will be very beneficial.
You sound just like a Delta scientist. Might work, might not work. That's why Peter Moyle has two hands.
There you go.
On the one hand, on the other hand. Would any of you like to respond to what?
Just to your comment there, she sounds like every scientist, not Delta, or my doctor. Well, this might work, it might not.
I'm sorry to hear that.
It's just the nature of the beast. If you want a solution, nobody except somebody getting paid going to say that, yes, this will do it.
Yeah. I want to come back to we've left out the policy, in that discussion, the policymaker side of this and the view from the policymakers. Do you think policymakers might be affected by such an organization? My own personal experience is that policymakers will tend to, especially elected officials will tend to choose the thing that they think is going to get them reelected, or is the most convenient for them. Are they forced into a bind with something like this, though?
Solid science is always the regulator's friend. It always makes things simpler to be able to have as broad a scientific foundation as possible that everyone agrees is reliable. It's just my experience has been that the more solid the scientific foundation we go into an issue with, the easier it is to make a decision, because you have decreased the bounds of uncertainty and you've decreased the area in which people can argue. So I do think it makes a difference. I think, and I've seen it personally with respect to San Francisco Estuary Institute and the problems that we deal with pollution in San Francisco Bay. It has worked, yes.
Jeff, when you have to go before your board and you have something like this behind you, that is a much more centralized community of science, even if it might go against what your board wants to do, does it make a difference? That's depressing.
Yes, it does make a difference. No one wants to tilt at windmills. At some point you just say, this seems to be where we're headed, and we're going to have to adjust. It's painful, but we're going to have to adjust, and that helps. And that actually can help politically, too. We can make expensive decisions that are unpopular if you can say, I've got the evidence that shows me we have to make this change, and we're going to spend the money to do it, and that helps them go back to the people. Then they have to go charge for that and say, here, there's a good basis for it. What's tough is there's just uncertainty out there, and what do? The instinct is paralysis. Well, let's go study it some more. And frankly, I think that's what we've been doing for a long time now. It's uncertain. Let's keep studying it. At some point, you gotta make a decision with the best information you have on hand. I think that's been the problem for the past decade. We've been unwilling to make decisions with pretty decent information. It's getting better, I agree, but at some point you just got to decide.
Yeah. It is so much easier to not make a decision, regardless, because the consequences are so high in controversy.
Do I have a minute?
Bruce.
Yeah. Just going back, I think it's been long enough now that I can bring this up. When we brought the new water quality standards out in '94, and there was an accord about it. It was the '94 Accord, which was not a Honda. And the transition there was that there had been a lot of arguing, there was a lot of combat science, and then Standard & Poor's threatened to degrade the bond rating for Metropolitan in the state of California. And all of a sudden there was a lot of pressure to find an answer. And we got an answer. So there are some fighting costs there. The amusing thing was that we were still coming out of combat science. People who had been doing combat science were suddenly in the process of having to come to an accord. And lovely documents of people 1 year later saying, oh, this is why we're doing this. This is all wonderful and good. And it was in stark contrast to the same things they'd been saying a year previous. But that change in which ox is getting gored and how it's getting gored suddenly brought people together and arguing things that they had been arguing 100% off, not in the far recent past. It was a very educational moment for me.
Yeah, negotiated solution. Yeah.
Perhaps I could just build a little on what Jeff said a moment ago. Yeah, uncertainty is making it very difficult to make decisions, but I think we need to be very clear about what is the source of that uncertainty. Because from the science perspective, there's a lot that we do know. There's also uncertainty because we're dealing with a very complex, open natural system. So there's uncertainty from that perspective too. There's uncertainty just because of the nature of what we're dealing with. Is it going to be a dry year or a wet year? And then there's the uncertainty that arises because of disagreement amongst scientists. And I think certainly for Jeff, it's perhaps our duty to be able to distinguish between those, because that's really what's hammering people like Matt. It's the uncertainty. It's not so much the actual numbers. And probably it's also why you're so committed to science, because you may get an agreement right now because of that uncertainty, but 3 years from now you'll be back at the table again. Whereas if you had some certainty looking a decade into the future, it makes it a much easier from the business perspective.
Well, this is a good transition then. So Peter, you get to bat cleanup in this group of four here. That's baseball, by the way. I know you're it's not cricket. And so you are the lead scientist, and we actually, in our proposal, had a pretty radical notion that you should be the lead scientist for the Delta, not just in title, but actually in practice. And that is to have, as part of the centralized approach, that there should be. I use this phrase: somebody to hang. We have no ability to hang anybody in this. Yeah, we have no ability to hang anybody in this because things like IEP is there's a series of heads. It's multiple people that are in charge, and nobody's in charge. So you got nobody to hang unless you're going to have a mass hanging. I'm sure Metropolitan thinks that might be a good idea on some days. So in this case, we're talking about a much more centralized approach to science, and I want to give you a chance to sort of react to this, because you are right in the middle of the process of proposing a Delta Science program, which is part of the Delta Science plan here, and there's some of this probably comports with what you're doing, and some of it is probably radically different. So I'm just going to give you the opportunity to kind of respond to it from the point of view of the guy who would hang.
Okay, so do I have a last wish as well?
Yes, there is lunch. Lunch will be served.
So perhaps my wish, but it's much more than that. It's a hope, and I can really see a new era opening up for California water science. And I think just as an example for that, the fact we're sitting here in front of close to 1,000 people that have shown up, and I'll say a big thanks to Ellen for promoting this public dialogue. But the fact that there's this level of interest, the knowledge that particularly from the science perspective, this is how we're going to make decisions in the future. And I think this sort of open forum, the ability to have diverse ideas to instill innovation, we're going to get to addressing these problems. So just a few of those things which have been thrown out and what you have as a science community to build on. First of all, it's immensely complex. I think if you look anywhere in the world, nothing is complex of this in terms of the scale, the economic consequences, and an incredibly fragile ecosystem. So for a place to do science, it's a wonderful place to do research. Secondly, if you look at the intellectual capacity, and I bet you if we polled this room, it would be quite remarkable. You have 3 of the top 10 universities in the world, according to the latest Chinese survey, 6 of the top 20. What the consequences of that are, if you look at the people who are working in agencies, in the NGOs, in local government, it's an incredibly high level of dialogue that's going on all of the issues. The third point is we've been going around talking to people about what the science program should look like. What we hear very, very clearly is that this is the time for change. We've been trying, as Bruce very clearly articulated, for the last 20 or 25 years. There's some great models out there in certain areas, but it's certainly not giving us that system-wide perspective that allows us to look like if you push the system, there's a certain finite number of knobs to deal with this. You hit this knob here, there's going to be consequences right through the system. And we've heard of that actually through Randy Fiorini and others on the Stewardship Council. And I think that there's beginning to be the structure of agencies to address these problems, whether it's collaborative science that BDCP is proposing, the really fundamental rethinking of IEP that it is really going to be quite exciting, and I think the Delta Stewardship Council themselves. So this concept of one Delta, one science, I'd like to make a few comments about that. First of all, if we're really going to make this work, this community of science, it needs to be independent. It needs to be open. It needs to be transparent. It needs to get out of the combat science I don't like, but if you listen to someone like Niels Bohr, if you look at how science develops, it's these competing hypotheses that allow for these big steps forward. And so we should be encouraging these differences of opinion, but make sure that these things which we're analyzing are indeed real. Thirdly, just down the road here, we have the hotspot for technology worldwide. We're really tapping into some of these technologies, whether it's environmental sensors, whether it's remote sensing, big data, major issue. There's some tremendous examples beginning to emerge about how we make data accessible. So let's build on these efforts. And then, finally, I think it's very important that what we've heard is you talk about science. If science is going to work, it isn't going to be scientists dictating to policymakers and heads of agencies how to do things. That would be totally wrong. What science can do is to look at alternative futures, give a realistic understanding of the uncertainties, the consequences of different actions. And we need to separate what the science is telling us from the final decision that's made, because there's a lot of societal judgment, value judgment that needs to go in between those levels. But I think from all of the folks we've spoken, this ideal committing to the concept of a science community, a shared body of knowledge, a process for identifying the legitimate disagreements in science, and then developing the types of process where we can really understand these differences and move science on in a very structured way. The last thing I would say, we've received a lot of comments about it can't be one science, it's stifling. Absolutely, that is not what we're proposing. What we're suggesting is this opportunity where you can explore different hypotheses, different ideas, and not just have the conventional wisdom because that's what 50% of people or 80% of scientists are saying. If there's a really cool idea coming out of a 26-year-old academic or a young scientist and an engineer in an agency, let's embrace that if it has scientific merit. So I truly believe that we can get there, and I think there's a lot to build on to make that happen.
This is great. You pointed out one thing, and maybe we should expand a little bit on that: the separation of science from policy. How many times have I listened to Phil Eisenberg explain to me that I'm an idiot, but you know, as a member of the scientific community, which is populated by idiots who actually aren't helpful in that policy side. I mean, we're accused of that all the time. So, I mean, what I worry about is this notion that it's so separate. In fact, I think that's one of the complaints, is that we don't do science that directly addresses policy. So there has to be some sort of scrum with the policymakers. It can't be completely separate.
But I think, Jeff, we need to separate those two issues. I agree totally, and I was at a meeting recently where one of the other very large ecosystem restoration programs and their science conference, over 300 papers. And someone asked one of the agency heads responsible what he thought of the science conference, and he said, well, it's absolutely wonderful. It's been a lot of fun. Great science, great questions, but I only counted 6 papers that are of use to me directly. And this is not unusual. So we need to separate that. Are we doing the science that will help inform policy? And we've been thinking a lot, and other people have, about how we ensure that we're directing the science and the research dollars to truly address the questions that Director Cowan and others are faced with, really tough questions. So yes, the science needs to be done. It needs to be there. It needs to be presented in an honest, transparent, open way. But that's very different to asking a group of scientists to say, okay, should we divert 90% of the flow from the delta this year or leave 90% as outflows? All we can do is advise on the potential consequences of those decisions. Because how we actually balance that, is it ESA versus water supply? That is not a science question. That's a societal policy question.
Great. Bruce.
I think it's a two-way conversation, and I like the diagram you had of the 4 quarters all feeding into what questions science should address. But there's a back flow on that, because science in California and in the Delta, no year is the same as any other year. Everything is always different. And so trying to pick out what is the impact of X on species Y in a system that changes this much is really, really tough, and the uncertainty is really huge. The only way to get at that is to send a really strong signal. So if you're not sure that this management action will do the job that you want it to do, and you have it within your capability to send a strong signal. So my favorite like this was, there's this whole brouhaha over whether the location of the low salinity zone fall is important or not. And so Fish and Wildlife Service in their biological opinion said, well, when we have water in the reservoirs, we're going to require that it be downstream, and when it's not, and we'll look at this. And this generated all kinds of brouhaha. And the one year when we actually got that through the fact that we had more water than we knew what to do with for once, we got a huge bunch of studies out there looking at how the system responded to that, but it's just 1 year. So there's questions there. But if you then say, okay, in wet years, half the time, we will have that by the policymakers, because we can afford to do it half the time. And the other half the time, we won't. So then you send a strong signal between those years you do and those years you don't, and you get an answer. Whereas if you just sit back and say, well, science, go and study that and tell us what you find out somewhere down the road, you'll come back with, there's just too much uncertainty to say. So if you don't want uncertainty, you have to do something. If you're happy with the uncertainty, then don't do anything and put it off a while longer and let the scientists go play.
You mean like what we've been doing all along?
Maybe. Maybe.
We have a few minutes left, and I want to turn now and see if there are questions from the and I would like them to be questions, but I suspect there'll be comments from the audience. So again, we have about 5 minutes more here before we take a break. So, are there any questions out there? I'm going blind here.
Can you see anything?
Yeah, I can't see anything because I'm relatively blind. Way back, way in the back. Stand up and yell.
Irrigation by agribusiness that really drives water didn't agribusiness and region builders start and continue this fight?
Would any of you like to answer that?
I think that was a comment.
I'm stumped.
Well, I think science will lead to an answer to that. You know. As long as it's sound science.
Jeff, I'm happy to agree with you.
Here we go.
Okay, there was another question over here in the blue shirt. Yell so we can hear you.
I'm worried that we might be conflating. I'm worried that we might be conflating combat science and being hypotheses. So I want to see how much those two things is integrated. What are you going on?
So, and that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say, because we in the scientific community, those of us in the scientific community, do vigorous combat with each other constantly. And that is the roots of science. And when you're getting a PhD, you are trained to go out and kill somebody's hypothesis. That's what you're trained to do. That's what we're trained to do. Which, by the way, makes some of the problem for connecting it with policy. If your goal is to actually make somebody else's idea wrong. Or proof that their idea is wrong. No, I think when we're talking about combat science, that is the selective choice of either information or selective studies which are intended to disadvantage someone else or create advantage for someone else's interest or advantage to your interest. And we can go through long examples of that. That's very different than competing hypotheses as an approach. Jeff?
Yeah, my comment was collaboration and competition are not mutually exclusive. And I believe that's what we have going on. I don't believe there has been combat science, in my view. People have very different perspectives, and they are funding work to be done. In my view, it's competition that's taking place. This isn't tobacco companies trying to just refute what's going on. We're trying to get at a very complex issue with a huge host of stressors and figure out which levers are we going to push. And that's it's a complex question. But that's what's taking place in my mind.
Question for Jeffrey Mount.
Was that God?
Yes.
and can we test that?
No one has been more critical than you of the role of litigation in these questions. But in those court cases that you're so critical of, what happened was that some of the advantages of that process was that it required the officials to step out of the faceless institutions that they serve and instead explain how they reached the decisions that they had. And what turned out was not that they were not very good at their job or not that other scientists would have done it differently. Instead, it turned out that they were making stuff up in some instances. They were lying about things. They broke the law. They were arbitrary and capricious. And the advantage of the court's involvement was that it could say, stop that. Do it better. Now, the academic institutions are not performing that role, and the normal rough and tumble relationships between regulatory agencies can't stop one another in that way. So what's wrong with that process? Why is what Terry calls reliable science afraid of that kind of sunshine?
So as you can imagine, the two of us pretty fundamentally disagree, but I'm going to let Peter talk.
So no, actually, I'd really like to respond to that, and I think what the problem with that is that sometimes it's putting young scientists in a very uncomfortable position. Our solution to that is, why go to the courts and the cost of that if there's legitimate questions? And there's many other mechanisms, some of which are run by the Delta Science Program, to get at those same issues. So when the agencies foresee these big questions coming up, the ability to call in an independent panel, the National Research Council does the same thing. It allows you to get to a much deeper level of discussion and dialogue in a more constructive way. Things which come out of that process could then move on to synthesis activities, which we haven't really spoken about here, but again, that was highlighted by the national academies. The ability to understand how these complex systems put together. So if these issues can be debated in an open science community, then I think we'll be a lot better off than sometimes, at least in my experience in the courts, you usually end up with a decision that's somewhere in the middle. And that might not be in the best, you're the best interest either of society or of the environment.
Okay, with that, I think we're going to go ahead and finish. And first, I want to thank all the panelists for their effort. Thank you very much. So there is a higher authority, and here she comes.